I want to talk about a technique that a few beginners seem to have a little bit of trouble with, and it's dry brush technique. Now I'll run through a very quick demonstration and then I'll do a full painting after. But it's a little bit of a misleading name really, dry brush. It probably should be called something along the lines of damp brush and dry paper, but I don't think that's got a very good ring to it. But like I said, I'll run through a very simple demonstration and then I'll do a full painting. But I've got quite a lot of water in the brush, and then you'll see there that the paint sinks straight into the paper. It doesn't leave behind any of that little bit of sparkle that we're looking for. And so I've reduced the amount of water in the brush. I just squeezed it out onto a tea towel there, and I dragged the brush across quickly, and you can see there's less water in the brush now, and there's a little bit of that sparkle forming. And so I reduced the amount of water in the brush a little bit more by picking up some of the dry paint in the palette there. Now drag the brush across very quickly again, and you'll see there's a lot more sparkle there. And so by reducing the amount of water in the brush but keeping it slightly damp, I get that sparkle. So I can drag some little vertical marks in there, and that could almost be little masts on a boat or something like that. Now I've got a bit more water in there, and you'll see it's not really forming that little sparkly edge. So essentially, control the amount of water in the brush and you'll get that little broken line. So I put some water on the paper there and I drag into that, and you'll see nothing happens at all. That's basically wet in wet, and that won't work. So dry paper and damp brush will get you that little broken line. So there's very little water in the brush at all now, but it's still ever so slightly damp, and I'm getting that little broken line. And you can use that for painting sparkly light on water or texture in the land. But what I'll do now is I'll run through a full demo. I'm just working on the back of an old sheet of paper here. It's a piece of cotton paper. And I'll paint a relatively simple scene. I'll paint the Thames estuary. So I'll start with the sky. And now I'm not going to overdo it with the dry brush. I think it's best used in moderation. Like all nice techniques, they're fun to do and they're very effective, but you want to hold back from using it too much, otherwise it can be very overpowering in a painting and it can be very distracting to the eye. So I lay in a fairly wet in wet sky. So I'm using some of the greys in the palette. I've put some cobalt blue into that. I'll use some of that brown that's in the palette there as well. I think that's a mixture of raw sienna and burnt sienna. And so I want quite a soft, cloudy sky. I can leave a few little white areas behind just for some light. But I'll save the little bit of dry brush that I add to this. I'll save for the water and a little bit of land in the foreground. And so really make the most of the technique by saving it for a few little areas, and then hopefully it'll add that tiny little touch of interest that I'm looking for. Okay, I'll bring that wash all the way down now. Brought it down to the horizon, so I'll go back into that blue grey and I can start laying some paint down for where the water's going to be. I can allow some of this to break up and get a tiny little bit of dry brush things happening there in the middle. And now I can either work with that or I can cover it over. But just by adjusting the amount of water in the brush, I can start getting tiny little areas breaking up. I've dried that wash off and I've got a few little sparkly areas in the middle there. But I'm going to add a little bit of land, some distance, And so, like I said, Thames Estuary, so there's some industrial things going off in the distance. And I'll suggest that really, really simply. So I've got some cobalt blue and I've mixed that into the grey. And so tiny little bit of distant land there. It'll dry very light, very pale. That helped with the recession and to push it off into the distance. And so there's all kinds of factories and things like that going on over there. So there's a big chimney, probably a few miles off in the distance. So I can suggest that with a couple of simple little marks. And now pick up some ultramarine, a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of raw sienna in there as well. So make that mixture slightly darker. And I can join that in. I want all this to blend together. A little bit more burnt sienna in there, so vary that mixture, make it a touch darker. And again, touch that in and blend all this one big shape together. And so with distance, I'm keeping it very simple. I don't like to use too much dry brush in a distance. It's best kept for foreground, so because you get those little hard edges. So again, darken that mixture ever so slightly. And so it gives the impression that there's some land drifting off away into the distance, further over to the left hand side it goes. And now I'm coming a tiny little bit closer now. So more ultramarine, more burnt sienna, but making it slightly browner. And I can get a touch of dry brush going on now, the tiniest little bit, allowing the paint to break up here and there. But this is still in the middle distance, so I don't want too much texture there. And now again, as I drag across the bottom there of the land, I can allow the paint to break up the tiniest little amount. Now that's pretty much that middle distance completed. So I switched to a slightly larger brush and I picked up some raw sienna. I've mixed that in with what's already in the palette. And now there's not a lot of moisture in the brush, so I'm dragging the paint across, and now I'm starting to get some of that dry brush texture going on in this land in the foreground. Modulate that mixture with a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of cobalt blue. And now probably say it's like a medium amount of moisture in the brush, so it's not too wet, and it's allowing the paint to drag across the dry paper and leave behind those little textural marks. And really, using dry brush technique for little areas like this, by doing very little at all, you can create hundreds or thousands of little textural areas really without doing much at all. And I think that's really what it's useful for. Now again, darken that mixture now, a bit burnt sienna and some ultramarine. I can lay some dark in there while that's still slightly damp. So getting a nice mixture of tiny little hard edges and some soft edges. Okay, I've dried that all off again now, and I'll try and get a little bit of dry brush in the water area as well. Get some of that little bits of sparkle. So I've mixed up some cobalt blues, a little bit of French ultramarine as well. I've mixed that into the grey in the palette. And there's, again, not a lot of moisture in the brush, so I can drag that across. Very, very light touch. And allowing the brush to drag across the texture of the paper, and it leaves behind those lovely little sparkly areas. And you really do have to be careful not to do too much of it. Don't, because it is a very pleasing technique, and once you get the hang of it, you'll enjoy it, and it does look good. But if you do too much, then it's very easy to overdo it. So like most nice techniques, it's less is more. I'm going to lay a bit of dark into this land as well, and I can get a tiny little bit of dry brush in there. I think I'll just touch a little bit of dark across that middle ground as well. So keeping everything very simple. I'll go back into the small brush, and I think I need a few little posts or something like that going on in the foreground. So a couple of very simple little lines there on the left hand side. I'll put a few posts in right close up here on the right hand side, and I'll use a tiny little bit of dry brush for that as well. It's nice to get a little broken edge. Gives the impression that maybe there's a little bit of light catching those posts. And again, drag a few little dark areas across this foreground, making connections as well between left and right. It's always a good idea to connect your darks as much as possible. You don't want to have a big strong line, but tiny little connections and little bits are lost and found. I very simply add a suggestion of a reflection there of those few posts. I think we're pretty much done. I'll try and get a suggestion of a reflection as well of that chimney. Don't want too much there really. And I think that's gone on a tiny little bit dark, so I'll touch that with a bit of paper towel. I just want a slightest suggestion of something there. Okay, that's the painting finished. That's the demonstration done. So using dry brush to get the sparkle on the water and a little bit of texture in that land, but keeping everything else very soft. So it helps to draw your eye towards a focal point if you use a little bit of dry brush, with it being a hard edge, and you get that little bit of sparkle. But do use it in moderation. But remember, it's not really a dry brush, it's a damp brush on dry paper. And so practice and try and work out how much water you need to get the texture that you need. If you're not getting that broken line and it's the paint's going on solid, you've probably got too much water in the brush. So get a little bit of water out of there and then try it again, and you'll soon get a feel for how much water you need. But anyway, that's the demo finished. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a like and all that kind of stuff, and send me a comment. It's always good to hear from everybody. And check me out on Patreon as well. I've got an exclusive video over there every week, so do check that out. And it's a good community. You can ask me questions, and I take requests for subjects and videos over there, so check that out. Anyway, thanks for watching everybody, and I'll see you in the next one.